The Federal Tactical Training Compound stretched across 40 acres of desert hardpan, its concrete walls and razor wire gleaming under the Arizona sun. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the transport van, her boots hitting gravel with a soft crunch that seemed too quiet against the backdrop of shouting instructors and clanging equipment. At 38, she was older than most of the recruits filtering through the registration tent, her gait marked by a barely perceptible hesitation in her left leg, a souvenir from Kandahar that she'd carried for 7 years. Her gear was standard issue, no custom patches or personalized accessories like the others sported. A worn leather notebook protruded from her chest pocket, its corners soft with age and constant handling. The only distinguishing mark on her was a pale scar across her right knuckle, raised and permanent like a brand from another life. "Excuse me, Mum," came a voice, thick with manufactured authority. Dominic Garrett, a 26-year-old former Marine with shoulders that seemed engineered for his tactical vest, stepped into her path. His aviator sunglasses reflected the compound's metal structures as he gestured toward a cluster of buildings. Mess halls that way, if you're looking for the cafeteria staff entrance. The joke landed exactly as intended. A ripple of chuckles followed from the group of recruits nearby, their energy crackling with the nervous aggression of men trying to establish pecking order. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't pause in her steady survey of the training yard. Her eyes moved methodically across the obstacle courses, the rappelling towers, the mock urban environments that would become her world for the next 8 weeks. Evan Blake, a barrel-chested former SWAT officer from Phoenix, slapped a hand against his hydration pack. "Civilian audit," he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been challenged. Either that or someone's mum got lost on the way to the PTA meeting. The laughter was louder this time, more confident. Sarah continued walking, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged. But something in her peripheral vision caught her attention, a young recruit standing slightly apart from the group, his jaw tight with discomfort. Marcus Thompson, she would later learn, fresh out of the army with a specialty in communications and a conscience that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. Captain Willis appeared with military precision, his silver hair catching the light as he read names from his clipboard. "Garrett!" A hand shot up. "Blake!" A nod. "Chen, here!" Then Mitchell, Sarah. The pause was microscopic, but real. Willis's eyes found her face, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped. He knew something. The recognition was there and gone in an instant, but Sarah caught it. She stepped forward with a simple nod. "Mitchell," Garrett muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "Sounds like a librarian." "Give her 3 days," Blake added, adjusting his gear with theatrical importance. "She'll be alphabetizing." The equipment room. Sarah remained motionless as they were corralled into formation. Around her, boots shuffled and gear clinked as the recruits jostled for position. Jokes passed between them like secret handshakes, establishing bonds she would never be invited to join. Her notebook stayed tucked against her gear, her breathing steady and controlled. As they began their first jog around the compound's perimeter, someone fell into step beside her. "Hope you brought comfortable shoes," the voice whispered. "This week's going to destroy those boots." Sarah didn't respond, didn't alter her pace. She maintained her rhythm as younger, fitter recruits pulled ahead, their tactical gear bouncing with each step. By the time they stopped for water, several were already red-faced and gasping. Garrett unhooked his helmet and let it swing from his fingers like a badge of casual superiority. "Think she even knows how to breach a door?" he asked the air, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet she read a manual about it once." Blake laughed, the sound sharp and mean. She's got that observer vibe, like she's here for the paperwork. Sarah pulled out her notebook and made a quick notation before returning it to her pocket. The pen clicked once, the only sound she'd made since arriving. Her movements were economical, precise, betraying no emotion as the group reformed for equipment selection. At the gear station, she moved through her choices with methodical efficiency. No questions, no hesitation, no visible confusion. One of the junior instructors raised an eyebrow at her selections, but said nothing. There was something about her approach that spoke of experience, even if no one was willing to acknowledge it. As they gathered near the rappelling tower for afternoon briefing, Layla Chen approached with predatory grace. A former tactical officer from Seattle, she wore confidence like expensive perfume, too much of it, and applied with deliberate precision. "You lost, ma'am?" Chen asked, her voice dripping with false concern as she gestured toward the towering structure. "This section's for the operators. Administrative offices are back toward the main building." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Sarah turned her head slightly, taking in the tower, the equipment, the faces watching for her reaction. She said nothing, but something shifted in her posture, not tension, not anger, but a kind of settling, like a sniper finding her position. "Hope. She packed snacks," someone muttered from the back of the group. "She'll be waiting at the bottom a long time." Garrett and Blake exchanged a high five, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls. But Sarah had already stepped into formation, calm and centered, her notebook tucked away and her hands resting easily at her sides. She hadn't smiled once since arriving, hadn't asked a single question, but the way she held herself made one thing absolutely clear. She wasn't confused, she wasn't nervous, and she sure as hell wasn't going anywhere. First blood. The mock suburban complex looked like a movie set designed by someone with a grudge against architecture. Plywood walls weathered grey, fake blood packets taped to mannequins in civilian clothes, and the lingering smell of paint and sawdust mixing with desert heat. Two instructors in black masks had positioned themselves inside as armed suspects, their voices carrying through thin walls as they shouted scripted threats. "Parameters are simple," Captain Willis announced through his megaphone. "Breach, rescue hostages, eliminate threats. You have 20 minutes. Dominic Garrett stepped forward before anyone could object, his natural assumption of leadership as automatic as breathing. "I'll take point," he declared, pulling out a marker to sketch his plan on a whiteboard propped against a sawhorse. "Blake, you're with me on primary breach. Chen handles rear exit. Thompson, you cover our 6. Sarah listened from the edge of the group, her eyes tracking the building's layout, noting the blind spots in Garrett's aggressive frontal assault plan. When she spoke, her voice was level and matter-of-fact. "You'll have a gap at the northeast corner," she said. "If they circle that flank during your breach, it'll put you in a crossfire with your own team." Garrett didn't even turn around. "Thanks for the tactical analysis, Mitchell. We'll keep that in mind." Blake grinned, his teeth white against his sun-darkened face. Tactical librarian strikes again. No one adjusted the plan, no one asked for clarification. They charged the building. 5 minutes later, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. The chaos was immediate and complete. Garrett's breach team hit the front door before their flashbangs had fully detonated. Blake slipped on loose gravel and accidentally discharged his paint round into a wall that wasn't even part of the scenario. From the unguarded northeast corner, exactly where Sarah had predicted, a masked instructor emerged and tagged 3 recruits with simulated kill shots before they knew what hit them. Chen panicked when she heard gunfire from inside and broke formation, running directly into the line of fire. Another instructor dragged a hostage dummy into the crossfire just as Garrett froze mid-command, overwhelmed by the cascading failures of his plan. The exercise ended with the sharp blast of a whistle and instructors shaking their heads in disgust. "That was a massacre," Garrett snarled, ripping off his tactical mask. "Complete amateur hour." Blake pointed an accusing finger across the lot towards Sarah, who hadn't moved from her observation position. "What was the point of having an observer if she's not going to actually help?" "We needed operators, not spectators," Chen added, her voice tight with embarrassment. Sarah walked away without a word, but that night in her bunk, she filled 3 pages of her notebook with diagrams, formation breakdowns, timing failures, and every tactical error she'd seen coming from a mile away. No one asked to see her notes. No one wondered what insights might be contained in those carefully drawn arrows and precisely written observations. The next morning brought equipment inspection, and Sarah's gear was flawless, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because perfection was simply her baseline. While other recruits scrambled to correct deficiencies, she sat quietly on her bunk, reading a technical manual on explosive breaching techniques. "Homework already?" Blake sneered as he passed. "Trying to catch up to the rest of us?" But Marcus Thompson, who'd been watching from across the barracks, noticed something the others missed. Sarah wasn't reading like someone trying to learn. She was reading like someone reviewing, her eyes moving too quickly, her page turns too confident, like she already knew the material and was just refreshing her memory. During afternoon combat drills, Sarah's performance was textbook perfect. Her shooting stance was solid, her target clusters tight, her movement through the course fluid and economical. She never showed off, never drew attention to herself, but she also never made a mistake, Garrett noticed. It was impossible not to. "Beginner's luck," he announced loud enough for the instructors to hear. "Wait until we get to the real scenarios." But that evening, as Sarah sat alone in the corner of the mess hall, the same corner table with chipped paint that had somehow become hers by default, Layla Chen approached with theatrical slowness. Her hand was a bright yellow notebook, the kind schoolchildren used, plastic and cheap and obviously meant as an insult. "Here," Chen said, placing it on the table with exaggerated care. "For taking notes, Professor. Maybe you'll catch up in a few years." Her voice carried across the cafeteria, syrupy and cruel. The entire room paused, waiting for Sarah's reaction to this public humiliation. Silverware stopped clinking. Conversations died. Even the kitchen staff seemed to be holding their breath. Sarah didn't look up. She didn't touch the notebook. She simply continued eating her meal with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The silence stretched until Chen's smile began to waver. Finally, she turned and walked back to her table, where Garrett and Blake waited with expressions of smug satisfaction. "Hope she's writing a cookbook," Blake said, loud enough to carry. "She's got the kitchen demeanor down pat." Laughter rippled through the mess hall, but it felt forced now, uncomfortable. Marcus Thompson pushed his tray away, his appetite gone. A few other recruits shifted in their seats, suddenly finding their food very interesting. Later that night, as Sarah lay in her bunk with her notebook open, carefully cross-referencing building schematics from the day's failed exercise, voices carried through the thin walls from the hallway. "Doesn't even scuff," the training mat, someone was saying. "You'd think she was allergic to getting dirty." "It's all optics over output with her type," came the reply. "She'll wash out by week 3, mark my words." But Sarah's pen never paused in its steady movement across the page. She was mapping every failure, cataloguing every weakness, preparing for something none of them could see coming. Because while they were busy performing their superiority, she was doing what she'd always done best: watching, learning, and getting ready to act when it mattered most. Week 3 brought the tower complex, a 3-story maze of corridors, stairwells, and rooms designed to break teams that relied on ego instead of discipline. Sarah's rope descent was flawless, controlled, and silent. No bounce on landing, no wasted motion, no drama. Behind her, Garrett came down hard, stumbling on impact while shouting instructions to recruits still on the platform above. Smooth as silk, Mitchell, Marcus Thompson said quietly as they gathered their gear. He was one of the few who'd started paying attention to her technique rather than her silence. "You've done this before, I've observed," Sarah replied, using her standard deflection. But Marcus caught something in her tone, not evasion exactly, but layers of meaning she wasn't ready to unpack. The day's scenario was apartment clearing, narrow hallways and blind corners that demanded patience and precision. Sarah moved through the mock building, like she owned the blueprints, checking angles others missed, maintaining spacing that kept her teammates safe without them even realizing it. Her muzzle discipline was perfect, her corner work textbook clean. She was never included in the formations, Garrett made sure of that, but she shadowed them anyway, providing unspoken backup that went unnoticed and unacknowledged. When Blake's radio harness came loose during a crucial movement, Sarah quietly reached over and reset the fastener before he even knew there was a problem. He never noticed. No one did except Marcus, who was beginning to understand that Sarah saw everything. That evening, the barracks hummed with the usual post-exercise energy. Gear being cleaned, stories being retold with editorial improvements, egos being soothed through volume and bravado. Sarah sat in her corner with a tablet, reviewing surveillance footage from the day's exercises, her notebook open beside her as she annotated frame-by-frame analysis of team movements. Still studying? Chen called out from across the room. "The test was 8 hours ago, Professor." "Maybe she's writing fan fiction about tactical operations," Blake added, and the room erupted in laughter. But Sarah was focused on a particular sequence, a 3-second gap in coverage during Blake's entry that had gone unnoticed by everyone except the cameras. She made a note, added a timestamp, and moved to the next clip. Around her, the noise continued, but she'd learned to work through it. Just after lights out, when the barracks had settled into the restless quiet of exhausted bodies, someone crept past her bunk. A piece of plastic tapped against her locker door, barely audible in the darkness. In the morning, she found a laminated visitor's pass taped to her vent. Pink, slightly bent, the kind used for civilian guests on military bases. Someone had scrawled, "Thanks for visiting." Across it in black marker, Sarah peeled it off with steady fingers and folded it into her notebook. Across the room, Garrett watched with half a smirk while Chen whispered something to Blake that made him snort with amusement. Marcus saw it too, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. What could he say? This wasn't official harassment. It was just Marines being Marines. The mock federal building was their biggest challenge yet, a full-scale urban scenario with multiple floors, civilian role players, and enough complexity to expose every weakness in their training. Garrett positioned himself at the command board like it was his birthright. "Chen and Blake, primary breach," he announced, marker in hand. "Thompson, your interior support." "Mitchell..." He paused, the silence deliberate and cruel. "You can monitor radio traffic. Make sure the equipment doesn't get bored." A few recruits chuckled, but the laughter felt hollow now. Even some of Garrett's Supporters were getting tired of the constant targeting. Sarah approached the instructor's table and handed over a manila folder. Inside were her notes from the previous exercises, detailed diagrams, optimal breach points, tactical recommendations based on building layout and hostage positioning. The instructor, Captain Rodriguez, flipped through the first few pages. His thumb paused on a particularly detailed schematic, and his eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. He closed the folder and set it face down on his clipboard, his expression unreadable. "Load out in 5 minutes," Garrett barked, already moving toward his gear. The exercise was a disaster from the first second. Chen's flashbang bounced off a doorframe and detonated near a hostage role-player. Blake stumbled while clearing a corner and took a simulated chest shot. Garrett's overlapping radio commands created confusion instead of clarity, and Marcus hesitated at a crucial stairwell, unsure which contradictory order to follow. From the upper floors, role-players with blank-firing weapons opened up, the sharp cracks echoing through the building. Garrett spun, missed his angle, and took a hit to his vest. "Who's got eyes on upper level?" he shouted into his radio. "We've got casualties down here." The chaos cascaded. More blanks fired, smoke grenades filled corridors, and communication broke down completely. A hostage role-player screamed as someone dragged her into the crossfire. The exercise ended with the harsh blast of a failure horn and instructors stepping in with red flags. Outside, as the team regrouped in shame and frustration, Garrett's humiliation boiled over into rage. "This was sabotage," he snarled, stripping off his helmet. "We had a solid plan until people started hesitating, started second-guessing instead of executing." "We needed support, not spectators," Chen added, her voice bitter with embarrassment. Blake nodded toward Sarah, who stood apart from the group, her expression unchanged. She just watched, just stood there while we got shredded. But Marcus had seen enough. "She tried to warn us about the northeast gap in Exercise 2, he said quietly. "We didn't listen." "Oh."
"Please," Garrett snapped. "One lucky guess doesn't make her an operator." Sarah remained silent, but something in her posture had shifted. Her weight was more forward now, balanced like someone preparing to move.
The folder she'd submitted lay untouched on Rodriguez's clipboard, its recommendations unread, its warnings ignored. That night, as she sat on her bunk with her notebook open, carefully documenting every failure she'd witnessed, every mistake she'd predicted, every life that would have been lost if the bullets had been real, Sarah made a decision. She'd tried the quiet way. She'd tried working within their system, offering help that was rejected, providing insights that were dismissed. But tomorrow would bring a new kind of test, one that would reveal exactly who belonged in these uniforms and who was just wearing a costume. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Real sirens, real crisis, real lives hanging in the balance. And for the first time since arriving at the compound, Sarah Mitchell smiled. When reality strikes. The sirens cut through the morning desert air like razors, growing louder until they seemed to vibrate in everyone's bones. Sarah was cleaning her weapon in the armory when the first alert crackled through the base-wide intercom. "Federal courthouse hostage situation. This is not a drill. All training suspended. Command staff. To Tactical Operations Center immediately." The transformation was instant and chaotic. Instructors who'd been casually observing training exercises suddenly sprinted across the compound, radios crackling with overlapping frequencies. Equipment that had been stored for demonstration was hastily loaded into tactical vans. The simulation compound, which minutes before had been filled with the controlled chaos of training, fell silent as recruits were ordered to benches and told to stay put. Sarah set down her cleaning rod and watched the organized panic unfold around her. Garrett stood with his mouth open, still processing the shift from exercise to reality. Chen and Blake huddled together, suddenly looking much younger than their swagger suggested. Marcus sat forward on his bench, alert and ready, but like the others, he'd been relegated to observer status. "This is what we trained for," Blake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Trained for?" Chen laughed, but it sounded hollow. "We can't even clear a building without shooting each other with paint rounds." The Tactical Operations Center, a room they'd glimpsed but never entered, erupted with activity. Through the windows, Sarah could see instructors juggling multiple phones, their faces tight with concentration. Surveillance feeds from downtown flickered on dusty monitors. A lieutenant colonel she'd never seen before burst through the doors, barking orders about codebooks and communication protocols. But something was wrong. The responses were fragmented, uncoordinated. People were running in different directions.
Voices overlapping, critical information getting lost in the noise.
Through the center's open doorway, Sarah could see the main communications station sitting empty, state-of-the-art equipment unused because no one was available to man it. She stood up from her bench and walked toward the building with the kind of casual determination that had defined her entire career. Behind her, Garrett called out, "Mitchell, where are you going?" They said to stay put. Sarah didn't respond. She stepped through the operations center doorway and approached Captain Rodriguez, who was trying to coordinate 3 different radio frequencies while listening to a satellite phone pressed to his other ear. "I'll take communications," she said. Rodriguez looked up, startled, his eyes scanning her face for a joke that wasn't there. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped, and she saw something flicker across his expression. Not recognition exactly, but consideration. Like a man remembering a detail he'd been told to forget. "You're not certified for—" "I'm certified," Sarah said simply. "Let me work." Rodriguez hesitated for another second, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Channel 1 stays clear. Federal response only. No chatter." Sarah slipped on a plate carrier, not frantically, not slowly, but with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of muscle memory, and settled at the communications station. Her fingers moved across the control panel with absolute certainty, adjusting frequencies, testing connections, establishing secure links with federal assets already moving toward downtown. Behind her, through the center's windows, she could see the other recruits watching with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Garrett's face was frozen in a half-smirk that no longer looked confident. Chen had gone pale. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense with sudden understanding. The main screen flickered to life, showing grainy surveillance footage from inside the federal courthouse. A man in civilian clothes held an assault rifle, his movements erratic and desperate. 3 hostages cowered against a wall, 2 women and an elderly man, their faces frozen in terror. Sarah keyed her microphone and spoke into the sudden quiet of the operations center. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. "Federal courthouse hostage taker, this is tactical command. You are being recorded. We have visual confirmation of your position.
I need you to confirm the number of hostages and tell me why you entered the building."
The response crackled back through the speakers, the man's voice high and wired with adrenaline. "I don't know who you are, but I want the snipers off the roof and no one coming through the front entrance. You try anything, and people start dying." Sarah's eyes never left the monitor feed. "We've pulled our people back from the roof," she said, though no such order had been given. "And I'm not sending anyone through the front door. You're scared. I understand that. But the way out isn't through violence. It's through control. And right now, you have that control. Rodriguez started to object, then stopped. Something in Sarah's tone, in the way she held herself, commanded attention even from superiors. "You don't get it," the man's voice came back, cracking with desperation.
No one understands what they've done to me. Do understand, Sarah replied. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the compound, her voice carried emotion. Not manipulation, but genuine recognition. You think you're alone. You think this is your only move. But I've been in tighter rooms than yours, and I've walked out every time. Let me walk you out of this one. She switched to an encrypted channel, her voice now clipped and professional. Agent Morrison, Agent Diaz, advance from
the north alley. There's an unguarded rear stairwell on the second floor. No sudden movements. Confirm visual before any action. The responses came back immediately. Copy that. Command. Moving to position. No one in the operations center questioned who she was talking to. No one asked how she had those call signs. They just watched as she orchestrated a response with the kind of precision that comes from experience, not training. On the main screen, they could see federal agents moving into position exactly as she'd directed. The hostage taker never saw them coming. His attention was fixed on the front entrance, just as Sarah had intended. 30 seconds, she said into her microphone, her voice gentle now, almost maternal. Make the right choice. I want you walking.
Out of there, breathing. The man's hands trembled on his weapon.
The rifle wavered, dropped an inch, then fell completely as he sank to his knees. Agents moved in smoothly, professionally, no shots fired. The hostages stumbled to safety, crying but alive. Scene secure, came the confirmation through the speakers. All hostages accounted for, suspect in custody. Sarah removed her headset and set it carefully on the console. The operations center was dead silent. Rodriguez stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Through the windows, every recruit sat frozen on their benches, their faces blank with shock. Garrett's mouth moved soundlessly. Chen had covered her face with her hands. Blake stared at the floor like he was afraid to look up. But Marcus Thompson was smiling, not with amusement, but with the kind of recognition that comes when pieces of a puzzle finally fall into place. Outside, the sirens were fading into the distance. The crisis was over. But for everyone who'd witnessed what just happened, everything had changed. Sarah adjusted her plate carrier and walked back toward the door, her expression unchanged, her movements unhurried. She'd done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. But as she passed Rodriguez, he caught her arm gently. "Agent Dale," he said quietly, using a name no one in the compound had heard before. "Well done." She nodded once and continued walking, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally beginning to understand exactly who had been living among them all along. The unraveling. The black SUVs arrived at dawn, their tinted windows, reflecting the first light off the compound's concrete walls. Sarah Mitchell, or whoever she really was, stood in the equipment room, methodically checking her gear one final time as voices echoed through the hallways outside. All personnel to the central courtyard, the intercom crackled, full formation. This is not optional. Garrett dragged himself off his bunk, his face haggard from a sleepless night. The courthouse incident had shattered something in him, some fundamental assumption about how the world worked. Chen moved like a sleepwalker, her usual sharp confidence replaced by hollow-eyed confusion. Blake hadn't spoken since yesterday, just sat on his footlocker staring at nothing. Only Marcus seemed alert, watching Sarah with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing shape. In the courtyard, 200 recruits from various training programs stood at attention while dust devils swirled between the buildings. The desert wind carried the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing closer. From the lead SUV stepped a man in a dark suit, no tie, his bearings suggesting federal authority without any need for introduction. Behind him came two agents in tactical gear, their badges glinting in the morning sun. But it was the third vehicle that held everyone's attention. The rear door opened and Sarah stepped out. Gone was the standard-issue tactical gear, replaced by a fitted black uniform bearing insignia. Most of the recruits had never seen Presidential Counter-Terrorism Task Force. Her badge hung from a lanyard at her waist, catching the light as she walked with that same steady gait, the slight limp still marking her left leg, but somehow less noticeable now, as if she'd stopped hiding it. The man in the suit stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the formation, without amplification. "Yesterday's courthouse incident was not part of your training curriculum," he announced. "It was a real threat to federal personnel and civilians. The individual who coordinated the response from this facility is not a recruit," murmurs
rippled through the formation.
Garrett's face drained of color. Chen swayed slightly on her feet. "Special Agent Sarah Dale," the man continued, "senior field strategist, credentialed in 7 federal jurisdictions, liaison to the President's Office for Domestic Counter-Terrorism.
Operations. The words hit like physical blows. Garrett's mouth opened and closed silently. Blake looked like he might be sick.
Chen stared at the ground, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The suit pulled out a manila folder, the same one Sarah had submitted before yesterday's disastrous building exercise. "We've reviewed all training footage, performance evaluations, and team dynamics assessments. Agent Dale's observations were precise, her warnings were ignored. Her recommendations confirmed a pattern of dangerous leadership failures." He opened the folder and began reading names. Dominic Garrett. Failure to adapt under pressure, resistance to collaborative intelligence, dismissal of tactical warnings. That would have prevented casualties in a real-world scenario. Garrett stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Sir, with respect, I led my team according to established protocols." "You led them into a crossfire," the man interrupted. "Agent Dale warned you about the northeastern exposure. You ignored her. In a real scenario, 3 of your people would be dead." 2 agents moved to flank Garrett. He looked around desperately for support that wasn't coming. Evan Blake. Layla Chen. More names, more agents, more recruits who had mistaken cruelty for strength. "You will not be returning to this program." As they were escorted away, the man turned back to the remaining formation. "Your technical skills are adequate," he said. "Your tactical knowledge is acceptable, but this program isn't just about what you can do. It's about who you are when everything goes wrong." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood at parade rest beside the SUVs. "Agent Dale spent 6 weeks observing your decision-making under pressure. She watched you choose mockery over mentorship.
Ego over effectiveness, cruelty over competence.
Some of you failed that test. Others," his eyes found Marcus in the formation, "others showed promise." The helicopters were closer now, their rotor wash beginning to stir the dust at their feet. Sarah stepped forward, and for the first time since anyone had known her, she addressed the group directly. "Loud doesn't mean right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Confidence doesn't mean competence, and rank doesn't mean readiness." She paused, her eyes moving across the faces in the formation. Some met her gaze with shame, others with newfound respect. Marcus stood straighter, his jaw set with determination. "The person next to you might know something you don't," Sarah continued. "The quiet one in the corner might see something you missed. The one you dismiss might be the one who saves your life." The helicopters settled onto the landing pad beyond the compound fence, their engines winding down. Sarah turned toward the SUVs, then paused and looked back. "This job isn't about being the loudest voice in the room," she said. "It's about being the right voice when it matters most." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward from the group of instructors, his face grim but respectful.
"Agent Dale," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Thank you for the lesson." Sarah nodded once, then walked to the waiting vehicle. The door closed with a soft click, and the convoy pulled away, leaving behind a compound that would
never quite be the same. In the weeks that followed, Marcus Thompson received a sealed envelope slipped under his door, specialized training track authorization. Supervisor S. Dale. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Quantico and a date 3 weeks away. At the bottom, in Sarah's precise handwriting, "Ready to learn how to really see?" The others who remained at the compound trained harder, listened better, and never again assumed that the quiet person in the corner didn't belong. Because they'd learned, too late for some, but not for all, that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you never see coming. And somewhere in the Virginia hills, in a training facility that didn't appear on any public maps, Sarah Dale was teaching a new generation of agents that strength without humility is just weakness wearing a costume. The lesson had been taught, the price had been paid, and the quiet ones would never be underestimated again. The reckoning. 2 months after the courthouse incident, Marcus Thompson stood in the lobby of a nondescript federal building in Quantico, his new credentials still crisp in his wallet. The address from Sarah's note had led him here, to a facility that officially didn't exist, run by people whose names appeared on no public roster. Agent Thompson, a young woman in a navy blazer, approached, her manner professional but warm. "Agent Dale is waiting for you in conference room C." The hallways were quiet, carpeted, nothing like the concrete and dust of the training compound. Through tall windows, Marcus could see other buildings scattered among Virginia pine trees, their purpose hidden behind reflective glass and subtle security measures. Sarah was sitting at a polished conference table when he entered, still in her black tactical uniform, but somehow looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. A cup of coffee steamed at her elbow, and several manila folders lay open before her. "You came," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would, but I've learned not to assume anything about people's courage." Marcus sat down, his eyes taking in the folders scattered across the table. Each contained photographs, surveillance images, tactical assessments. "What is this place?" "Advanced Tactical Intelligence Division," Sarah replied. "We handle threats that fall between the cracks of other agencies: domestic terrorism, federal facility security, hostage negotiation, the cases nobody else wants because they're too complicated or too politically sensitive." She slid one of the folders across the table. Inside were photographs from the courthouse incident, not just the official crime scene photos, but surveillance footage from multiple angles, tactical diagrams showing optimal response patterns, psychological profiles of both the hostage taker and his victims. 43 minutes, Sarah said. That's how long it took from the first 911 call to suspect in custody. No shots fired, no casualties, minimal trauma to the hostages. By federal standards, that's exceptional. Marcus studied the timeline charts, the coordination diagrams, the psychological assessment of the perpetrator.
How did you know what to say to him? Because I listened to what he wasn't saying. Sarah pulled out another folder, this one thicker, marked with security classifications Marcus had never seen before. Thomas Bradley, 42, former federal employee.
Terminated 6 months ago for falsifying safety reports. Divorced, facing bankruptcy, convinced the system had destroyed his life. She pointed to a psychological profile clipped to the inside cover. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He wanted to be heard, wanted someone to acknowledge what had happened to him. The rifle was theatre, dangerous theatre, but still performance. And if you'd been wrong, Sarah's expression didn't change, then agents, Morrison and Diaz, would have taken the shot. But I wasn't wrong because I'd been watching people like Bradley my entire career. Desperate people don't follow the same logic as tactical manuals. Marcus closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. How long have you been doing this? The undercover work, I mean. 15 years, different agencies, different covers. Sometimes I'm a recruit, sometimes a new employee, sometimes a transfer from another department. I observe, assess, report. Most. People never know I was there, but the compound was different. Sarah nodded slowly. The compound was supposed to be routine. 6 weeks of observation, file a report on training effectiveness, recommend curriculum adjustments. But what I found there... She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. What I found was a culture of casual cruelty. People who confused aggression with competence, volume with authority. Garrett and the others. They weren't just bad operators. They were dangerous ones, the kind who get people killed because they can't admit they don't know everything. Sarah pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a video feed from the training compound. This is from last week, on screen, a new group of recruits moved through a building clearance exercise. Their movements were cautious, coordinated, professional. When one recruit spotted a tactical flaw in their approach, the team leader stopped, listened, and adjusted the plan accordingly. Different. Culture now, Sarah observed. Word travels in law enforcement communities. People know what happened at the compound. They know what happens when expertise gets dismissed because it doesn't come wrapped in the right package. Marcus watched the video, noting the stark difference from his own training experience. Is that why you do this? To change the culture? Do this because someone has to. Sarah closed the tablet and met his eyes directly. Every federal facility, every tactical unit, every specialized program has informal power structures that can override official training. People like Garrett who think leadership means never admitting you might be wrong. People like Chen who confuse mean with strong. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the pine trees swaying in the afternoon breeze. 3 years ago, a federal building in Oklahoma was evacuated because of a bomb threat. Local tactical. Team ignored the building engineer's warnings about structural weaknesses in the basement. 2 agents died when a support beam collapsed during the search. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The engineer was right. The engineer was a 60-year-old woman who'd been maintaining that building for 25 years. The tactical team leader was a 30-year-old former Marine who thought her concerns were administrative paranoia. Sarah turned back to face him. Sound familiar? The parallel was unmistakable. Marcus thought about all the times he'd watched Sarah's warnings get dismissed, her observations ignored, her expertise discounted simply because she didn't fit someone else's idea of what competence looked like. "How many more are there?" he asked. "People like you working undercover? Enough. We're embedded in training programs, federal agencies, local law enforcement divisions, watching for the patterns that get people killed. The overconfidence, the closed-mindedness. the assumption that loudest means rightmost. Sarah returned to her seat and opened another folder, this one containing what looked like recruitment profiles. Which brings me to why you're here. You saw what the others missed. You questioned what needed questioning. You had the moral courage to recognize expertise even when it came from an unexpected source. Marcus studied the profiles in front of him. All young agents, all with similar backgrounds to his own. You're recruiting. I'm building a team. People who can see past surface assumptions, who can adapt when their initial assessments prove wrong. People who understand that the most important tactical skill isn't shooting or breaching or commanding, it's listening. She slid a contract across the table. Official federal letterhead with classification levels Marcus had only heard rumors about. Advanced Intelligence Division Undercover Assessment Program. You'd spend 6 months in training here, then receive long-term assignments in various federal facilities. Your mission would be to observe, assess, and report on organizational culture, leadership effectiveness, and operational readiness. Marcus picked up the contract, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what was being offered. I'd be doing what you did at the compound. You'd be preventing the next courthouse incident, the next Oklahoma building collapse, the next time good people die because someone in charge was too proud to listen to expertise that didn't come in the package they expected. Outside the window, shadows were lengthening as the afternoon moved toward evening. Marcus thought about the compound, about Garrett's dismissive arrogance, about Chen's cruel games, about all the warnings that had gone unheeded. When do I start? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd ever seen from her. Tomorrow. You're first. Assignment is observing a joint task force training exercise in Colorado. Interagency cooperation, federal and local law enforcement working together. Multiple agencies, multiple egos, multiple opportunities for dangerous assumptions. She handed him a new folder, his mission brief already prepared. Your cover identity is Marcus Torres, lateral transfer from the DEA. You'll be the quiet one they underestimate, the observer they dismiss, the expertise they ignore. Marcus opened the folder and began reading his new biography. And if they make the same mistakes Garrett did, then you'll do what I did. Watch, document, and when the moment comes, when lives are actually on the line, you'll show them what real competence looks like. She stood and extended her hand. Welcome to the real training, Agent Torres. Time to learn how to save the people who don't even know they need saving. As Marcus shook her hand, he realized his education was just beginning. The compound had taught him to recognize the difference between performance and competence. Now, Sarah Dale was going to teach him how to be the quiet voice that speaks up when it matters most. And, somewhere in Colorado, another group of federal agents was about to learn the same lesson the compound had learned. Never underestimate the person you don't see coming. The new mission. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the parking lot of a Colorado training facility, watching federal agents from 5 different agencies attempt to coordinate a joint operation. The DEA credentials in his wallet identified him as Marcus Torres, and the backstory Sarah's team had created was flawless. 2 years in narcotics enforcement, solid record, no red flags. Just like Sarah had been at the compound, he was unremarkable. By design, Torres, Agent Bradley Walsh from the FBI, waved him over to a group clustered around tactical vehicles. You're with Team 3, we're taking the south entrance. Walsh was everything Marcus had learned to recognize, loud, confident, dismissive.
Of input that didn't come from his immediate circle.
Within 5 minutes of conversation, Marcus catalogued the warning signs, interrupting other agents mid-sentence, dismissing local law enforcement as backup only, and referring to the DEA contingent as the drug guys with barely concealed disdain. The scenario was a joint raid on a suspected arms trafficking operation, multiple buildings spread across a warehouse complex. Intelligence suggested the targets were heavily armed and had federal law enforcement experience. It should have been a textbook case for careful coordination and mutual respect between agencies. Instead, it was turning into a turf war. Bureau takes primary on this, Walsh announced to the assembled teams. We've got the most experience with organized trafficking operations. Agent Carmen Rodriguez from ATF stepped forward, her jaw tight. Actually, arms trafficking falls under our jurisdiction. DEA handles narcotics, Bureau handles federal crimes, but weapons are ours. The wiretaps were federal court orders, Walsh countered. Bureau evidence, Bureau case. Marcus watched the dynamics unfold exactly as Sarah had trained him to see them. Each agency protecting their territory, each supervisor more concerned with credit than coordination. The local sheriff's deputies stood in the background, their valuable knowledge of the area geography being completely ignored. During the briefing, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach clench. The building layout showed a rear access road that connected to a county highway, a perfect escape route that none of the federal teams had accounted for in their planning. When he tried to raise the issue, Walsh waved him off. We've got the exits covered, Torres. Stick to what you know. But they didn't have the exits covered. Marcus could see it in their formation plans, in their deployment patterns. They were setting up for a standard front door raid while completely missing the back door escape route that any experienced criminal would spot immediately. During equipment check, Marcus found himself standing next to Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the county force who'd been relegated to perimeter security despite knowing the area better than anyone. They're missing the service road, she said quietly, confirming his assessment. You tried telling them? Santos snorted. Tried telling the FBI agent in charge. Got told that local law enforcement should focus on traffic control and leave the tactical planning to the professionals. Marcus felt the familiar frustration Sarah must have experienced at the compound, expertise being dismissed, warnings being ignored, disaster building with mathematical precision. The raid launched at dawn with the kind of aggressive confidence that masked fundamental tactical errors. Walsh's team hit the front entrance hard, flashbangs and shouted commands while ATF took the side-loading dock. Marcus was assigned to overwatch with the DEA contingent, essentially sidelined while the other agencies handled what they considered the real work. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. Teams advanced through empty buildings, finding evidence of arms trafficking but no suspects. Walsh's voice crackled through comms with increasing satisfaction. Primary building secure, no resistance encountered. Looks like they cleared out. But Marcus was watching the rear access road through binoculars, and what he saw made his blood freeze. 3 vehicles moving fast along the service road that connected to the county highway, vehicles that matched the intelligence descriptions of cars associated with the trafficking operation. He keyed his radio. Command, this is Torres. I've got 3 vehicles exiting through the rear service road, moving toward Highway 34. These match our target vehicle descriptions. Walsh's response was sharp, with irritation. Torres, you're supposed to be watching the
North Perimeter. Stay in your lane, Agent Walsh. These vehicles are fleeing the scene. If we don't intercept them now, Torres, maintain radio discipline. We've got this handled, but they didn't have it handled. Marcus watched through his binoculars
as the 3 vehicles reached the highway and disappeared into traffic. The entire leadership of the trafficking operation, along with what looked like critical evidence, had just escaped because no one had listened to the local deputy who knew about the service road. Deputy Santos appeared at his elbow, her face grim. Think they'll figure it out eventually. When they realize all they caught was an empty warehouse and some low-level couriers, and that's exactly what happened. After 2 hours of searching, the teams had netted 3 minor players and a warehouse full of evidence, but none of the major targets. The vehicles Marcus had spotted were confirmed stolen and found abandoned 20 miles away. Their occupants vanished. During the post-operation briefing, Walsh was furious but directing his anger in all the wrong directions. "Someone leaked the operation," he declared. "The targets knew we were coming." Agent Rodriguez from ATF shook her head. "Or they had a good escape plan and we didn't account for all the exits." "We covered all the documented exits," Walsh insisted. That's when Deputy Santos stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Agent Walsh, I tried to inform you about the rear service road during planning. That road connects directly to the highway and isn't visible from your overwatch positions." Walsh's face went red. "Are you saying this failure is because we didn't listen to local traffic control?" The tension in the room was explosive. Marcus recognized the moment, the same kind of defensive anger Garrett had shown when his tactical failures were exposed. Walsh was about to double down on his mistakes rather than admit he'd been wrong. But this time, Marcus was ready. "Actually," he said, standing up from his position at the back of the room, "Deputy Santos is right. I observed the 3 target vehicles using that exact route to escape. I attempted to alert command but was told to maintain radio discipline." The room went silent. Walsh stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You observed the targets escaping and didn't pursue?" Agent Rodriguez asked. "I was told to stay in my lane," Marcus replied, his voice level, but carrying just enough edge to make the point clear. Walsh realized too late that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. "You should have insisted, like Deputy Santos insisted about the service road," Marcus interrupted, "like Agent Rodriguez insisted about ATF jurisdiction over weapons trafficking. How many times should expertise be dismissed before we're allowed to act on it?" The parallels were unmistakable, and everyone in the room could see them. Walsh had created a culture where his authority mattered more than operational success, where being right was less important than being in charge. Agent Rodriguez turned to Walsh, her voice cold with professional disappointment. "We lost the primary targets because you wouldn't listen to local intelligence and wouldn't coordinate with other agencies. That's not operational security, that's operational failure." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Walsh was removed from Joint Operation Command and transferred back to a desk job in Denver. Agent Rodriguez took over the Reform Task Force, with Deputy Santos elevated to Tactical Liaison and Marcus officially recognized for his field observations. But the real victory came 3 weeks later when Marcus received a secure message. From Sarah Dale. "Heard about Colorado? Well done. Ready for the next assignment?" He was. Because now he understood what Sarah had been teaching him all along, that the most important tactical skill wasn't commanding or controlling or dominating, it was recognizing expertise wherever it came from and having the wisdom to listen when it mattered most. The next assignment would be different, but the lesson would be the same. In a world full of people who confused loudness with leadership, the quiet voices were often the ones that saved lives, and Marcus Torres was ready to be one of those quiet voices, watching and waiting for the moment when someone would need to hear the truth they didn't want to listen to. Full circle. 1 year after the courthouse incident, Sarah Dale stood in the observation deck of a new federal training facility in Montana, watching the latest class of tactical recruits work through a complex hostage scenario. But this wasn't the same kind of training she'd endured at the compound. The culture had fundamentally shifted. Below she could see a team leader, a young woman named Lisa Chen, no relation to the Layla who'd been dismissed. carefully listening to input from a quiet recruit who'd noticed a tactical flaw in their approach. Instead of dismissing the observation, Chen adjusted the plan, credited the recruit publicly, and executed a flawless rescue operation. "Different world down there," said Captain Rodriguez, who'd requested transfer to this facility after the compound
incident. He stood beside Sarah, both of them watching the exercise unfold.
"We've had 12 training cohorts since your assessment, and not one has had the cultural problems we saw before." Sarah nodded, her eyes tracking the smooth coordination between team members. "Fear is a powerful teacher. Word travels fast in federal law enforcement. People know what happens when expertise gets dismissed." Her tablet chimed with an encrypted message from Marcus, Agent Torres, as his current assignment knew him. He was embedded with a joint task force in Miami, monitoring interagency cooperation on a major trafficking case. His reports showed the same pattern she'd observed everywhere. Agencies were listening better, collaborating more effectively, checking their egos at the door. "Agent Dale," a voice behind her made her turn. A young man in cadet uniform stood at attention, his posture respectful but not fearful. "I'm Cadet Williams. I was told you wanted to see me." Sarah studied him for a
moment.
Williams was everything she'd learned to look for: quiet competence, observational skills, the kind of moral courage that couldn't be taught in a classroom. His instructors had flagged him as someone who saw patterns others missed, who spoke up when it mattered but didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. "At ease, Williams. I have a proposition for you." She handed him a manila folder, the same kind she'd given Marcus a year ago. Inside were recruitment materials for the Advanced Intelligence Division, psychological profiles of successful undercover assessments, and a mission brief that would take him places most federal agents never imagined. "Undercover assessment," she explained, as he read. "Long-term assignments in various federal facilities. Your job would be to observe organizational culture, identify leadership problems, and prevent the kind of failures that get people killed." Williams looked up from the folder, his eyes bright with understanding. "Like what you did at the desert compound. Exactly like that. Sometimes you'll be the recruit everyone dismisses. Sometimes you'll be the transfer nobody pays attention to. Always, you'll be the person who sees what others miss and speaks up when lives are on the line. And if they don't listen," Sarah smiled, remembering her own question from so long ago. "Then you do what Marcus did in Colorado, what I did at the courthouse.
You show them what real competence looks like." Williams closed the folder and met her eyes directly. "When do I start?" "Next week. There's a joint training exercise in Virginia, FBI, ATF, Homeland Security, and local law enforcement. Multiple agencies.
Multiple egos, multiple opportunities for the kind of assumptions that get people hurt." She handed him a second folder containing his cover identity and mission parameters. "Your name will be James Wilson, lateral transfer from Border Patrol. You'll be the one they underestimate, the voice they dismiss, the expertise they ignore." As Williams read his new biography, Sarah's phone buzzed with a priority message. Another situation developing, this time a prison standoff in Nevada, where inter-agency coordination was breaking down and lives were hanging in the balance. "Agent Dale?" Rodriguez appeared at her elbow. "Priority call from Nevada. They're requesting
immediate consultation." Sarah looked out at the training exercise one more time, watching competent professionals work together with mutual respect and shared purpose.
This facility didn't need her anymore. The culture had changed, the lessons had been learned, the next generation was being trained properly. But somewhere in Nevada, people were making the same old mistakes, dismissing expertise, ignoring warnings, letting ego override effectiveness. And somewhere in that chaos, innocent lives were depending on someone having the courage to speak truth to power. "Williams," she said, turning back to the young agent. "Consider this your final exam. You're coming with me to Nevada. Time to see how the real world tests everything you think you know." Williams straightened, his face serious but determined. "Yes, ma'am." As they walked toward the helicopter pad, Sarah reflected on how far they'd all come. The compound had been just the beginning, a single data point in a much larger pattern. But that pattern was changing now, facility by facility, agency by agency, one quiet voice at a time. Marcus was in Miami, teaching joint task forces how to listen. Williams would soon be in Virginia, watching for the warning signs she'd trained him to recognize. And she was heading to Nevada, where someone was about to learn the same lesson. Garrett and Walsh and countless others had learned before them. The person you dismiss might be the person who saves you. The helicopter lifted off into the Montana sky, carrying Sarah toward another crisis, another chance to prove that humility wasn't weakness, it was the most tactical position of all. Below them, the training facility grew smaller, but the lessons being taught there would ripple outward for years to come, because the quiet ones were watching now. The overlooked ones were listening. And when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance and expertise mattered more than ego, they would be ready to speak the truth that no one wanted to hear, but everyone needed to know. In a world full of noise, the whisper of competence would always cut through. Sarah Dale had made sure of that, and as the helicopter banked toward Nevada, she was already planning how to teach that lesson one more time to people who thought they already knew everything they needed to know. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The ripple effect. 5 years later, a young FBI agent named Jessica Parks stood in a briefing room in Seattle, listening to a Joint Task Force commander dismiss concerns raised by a quiet DEA analyst about gaps in their operation plan. The analyst, a soft-spoken woman named Amy Chen, had identified potential escape routes the team hadn't considered. "Thanks for the input," the commander said with barely concealed condescension. "But I think we've got this covered." Jessica felt something familiar stir in her chest, a recognition of patterns she'd been trained to see, warnings she'd been taught to heed. She stood up from her position at the back of the room. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the noise, "Agent Chen is right. I've reviewed the surveillance footage, and there are 3 unmonitored exits that connect to major transportation routes." The room went quiet. The commander's face tightened with irritation. "Agent Parks, I don't think a junior agent needs to be second-guessing tactical planning." Jessica smiled, the same kind of calm, confident
expression Sarah Dale had worn in a courthouse crisis years before. "I'm not second-guessing anything.
"I'm preventing unnecessary casualties by ensuring we account for all variables." She walked to the front of the room and began pointing out the gaps in their coverage, the assumptions that could get people killed, the expertise that was being dismissed, simply because it came from the wrong source. Later, after a successful operation that captured all the primary targets thanks to the adjusted plan, the task force commander approached Jessica with grudging respect. "How did you know to listen, sir?"
"Chen?"
he asked. Jessica thought about her training, about the stories that had become legend in federal law enforcement circles, about a quiet woman at a desert compound who'd taught an entire generation that strength and humility weren't opposites. They were partners. "Someone taught me that the most dangerous person in any room is the one you don't see coming," she said. "And the most valuable voice is often the one that speaks quietly." The commander nodded slowly, filing away a lesson he was only just beginning to understand. Across the country, in training facilities and federal buildings and crisis situations, other agents were having similar conversations. The ripple effect continued to spread, one quiet voice at a time, one overlooked expert at a time, one moment of moral courage at a time. Sarah Dale's lesson had become doctrine. Listen to expertise, wherever it comes from. Respect competence over confidence. And never ever underestimate the person everyone else dismisses. Because in a world where being loud often gets confused with being right, the quiet ones were the ones who saved lives. And they were everywhere now, watching and waiting and ready to speak truth to power when it mattered most. The lesson had been learned. The culture had changed. And somewhere in the federal bureaucracy, Sarah Dale was already planning the next lesson for those who thought they had nothing left to learn, because the work was never finished. But now she didn't have to do it alone. They mocked her at SWAT training, but she taught them all that true strength whispers while weakness shouts. And when lives hang in the balance, it's the whispers that save the day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part
of our Everyday Life Stories community.
Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked or acted? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire our next story.